Well, it's really nice to be with you. It feels like kind of coming home again to the Deanery Synod. And thank you for inviting me. It's a really important topic, and Caroline has given me quite a tall order to talk about the current ecological crisis and our response as Christians in 15 minutes. So hold on to your hats, because we're going to whistle through quite a lot of stuff. I've got some pictures to share with you, which will hopefully help to focus our minds. I think probably save your questions for the end. We're going to have a time, we're going to go into rooms and discuss things afterwards, and then there will also be some questions, the time for coming back at the end to ask general questions. So yeah, so let me just share my screen. If you're not on mute, it might be useful to put yourself on mute, just so we don't get everybody's clocks and dogs and all that kind of stuff in the background. I've just muted my clock and my dog. Right, can you see that? I can't now see anybody at all, but is that working?
Yes, it is.
Quiet. Yep, okay, yep. Fine. Everyone's gone very quiet and I can't see anybody somehow or other. My screen's gone blank. Okay, so
I can't see anything.
You can't see anything. Okay, you should have a picture which has hope.
Well, it says it's Caroline black. Ah, yes. Yes.
There we go.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I think it just took a while to grind into action. Okay. So hope. Good topic. I think we should I always want to root when we're thinking about the environment and the ecological crisis. I think it's really good to root that in hope. 1 Peter 1:3 says that as people of Christ, we are called again into a living hope. And I think that so much about the environment can feel very hopeless. It's doom and gloom. And I'm going to start, I'm afraid, with a bit of doom and gloom. But I think I just want to keep that word hope sort of lodged in our brains, because I think it's really important that as Christians, particularly as Christians, we bring that message of hope into all our conversations around the environment, around creation, about what we're going to do about it. So just very briefly, I'm going to do a very quick introduction to where we're at environmentally, sort of globally. Then we're going to kind of home in a bit into what we are doing in the diocese, what the diocese is encouraging churches to do, and in terms of some practical actions that we might be able to do in our own churches. So that's where we're going to start. Let me just see if I can make this move. Right, okay, so here we go. If I'd been doing this talk a few years ago, I'd have gone through all sorts of stuff about global warming, climate change, the sort of science behind it. I think most of us have probably seen and heard and read a great deal about that in the last few years. David Attenborough, Greta Thunberg, all of these people have been drawing it to our attention. I think the vast majority of people now accept that climate change is real, it's happening, it's caused by our human activities, and we need to do something about it. That's the bottom line. So that's where it's coming from. It's caused by us humans burning fossil fuels, which has started in the Industrial Revolution and has continued to grow ever since then. As a result of releasing fossil fuels, burning fossil fuels, which have been stored underground into the atmosphere, we are creating this warm blanket around the world, around the Earth, effectively. So we are trapping heat in the Earth's atmosphere, and that's happening faster and faster and faster. So these are two maps. I don't know if you can see them on your screens. The first one is in June 1976, which those of you who were around in 1976 will remember that was the long hot summer that we recall. Some of us remember. I was a child at the time. And the next one is in June 2018. So that's how many years later? 40 years later, roughly. And you can see that average global temperatures on the left there, the blue is cooler than average, the orange is hotter than average. But you can see that generally the trend is towards yellow and orange. The whole Earth is warming up, and it's warming up at a very fast rate. This was Australia. You remember January or around Christmas last year, just before COVID struck, Australia had wildfires. And these are the kind of temperature anomalies they are seeing in Australia. I mean, there's a really frightening statistics. This is another, there are hundreds of these things, but different ways of portraying what's happening. But this is the average UK temperatures in the last 120 or so years. You can see that obviously temperatures are not constant, they go up and down, that's called weather, but there are longer term trends which scientists are looking at, and it's pretty obvious from looking at those stripes that we are getting hotter all the time, and the last 10 years have been the hottest in recorded history. So as a result of these increased temperatures in the atmosphere, we are seeing what we call global warming, climate change. I prefer the terms though global weirding or climate chaos, because it's really about unpredictability. It's about the fact that there's more energy, there's more heat in the system, and as a result, everything happens in more extreme ways. So we have bigger rains, bigger droughts, bigger floods, stronger winds. Everything's more energetic, and that of course causes huge impacts. So that was in the States a couple of years ago. You remember they had a huge, unprecedented levels of snowfall. We see wildfires in Europe causing excess deaths from heat. We see more and more hurricanes and storms doing sort of really things they've never done before, like just stop. Do you remember that one in the Bermuda, Bahamas, last year, where it just sort of stopped, and that's never happened before, and it just sat over an island for some days. Clearly droughts, we're all used to that, and this is the Somerset Levels, so it's not just far away. This is the Somerset Levels. 2 winters ago, if you recall, there were some really severe floods. So everything's happening bigger, faster, stronger than it's happened before, and it's happening close to home as well as far away. Obviously, the people who are impacted first and worst from climate change are the poorest of the poor. These are our global neighbours who are feeling increasing temperatures. They're seeing all of these different features of climate change in their own lives, and they're exacerbating global poverty. As Catherine Hayhoe, who's a Christian climate scientist in the States, she says climate change is a threat multiplier. So everything that happens is more extreme and is increased by climate change. Now, last year, as you know, we've had an extraordinary year, and some scientists have called it the anthropause. This was a pause in the Anthropocene, and the Anthropocene is the current geological era, where scientists have talked about this current period of time. We've moved from the Holocene, if you're a geologist, to the Anthropocene, where human activities are dictating how the Earth responds. That's the first time ever that that's happened. So we're now in the Anthropocene, and last year was the Anthropause, when suddenly, as you will remember, there were these extraordinary photographs of clear skies and nothing, bird song, all sorts of stuff, and people began to wake up and appreciate nature and the environment in perhaps a new way. Sadly, it's a temporary blip, and if you look at the statistics in terms of global carbon emissions, they are very temporary. This is where we're at the moment. You will know, I'm sure, that in 2015 there was a big international climate talks, the COP talks, COP21 in Paris, and the nations of the world committed to trying to limit global temperature rises to no more than 1.5 degrees above where we were pre-industrially. As you can see in that diagram, we have nearly reached that point already, and our current pledges and targets are nowhere near good enough. As you know, G7 is happening this weekend. That's the beginning of a huge conversation globally about how we're going to increase our ambition and reach these kinds of targets. And all the way through this year, we're going from G7, and then in November we have the COP26, which will be in Glasgow at the end of the year, where the Pope, amongst many other important people, will be present, which I think indicates how seriously he takes it. And many Christian leaders do as well. So that's where we're at the moment. We have a long, long way to go. And it's incredibly important that Christians raise their voices in this conversation. So we've talked about climate change, but it's not the only problem. Sorry, we will get more positive in a bit, but this is the gloom and doom bit. This is a graph that's been doing the rounds in the sort of environmental world. We've had COVID, we're having COVID. It is obviously a very tragic and serious global catastrophe. Behind it may well come a recession, and we hope and pray that won't be as bad as some had feared when this cartoon, I think, was drawn. Climate change is probably it's definitely undoubtedly a bigger and more serious problem in terms of its impact on people's lives. But behind that is biodiversity collapse, which could even be bigger than climate change. These are two sort of twin intractable problems, which we really need to take seriously. This is a graph which is just very sobering. I think most of us on this call were probably born before 1970. So within our lifetimes, this is a graphic from the World Wildlife Fund's Living Planet report. They do a sort of state of biodiversity every year. They produce this very, very, very good report. Within our lifetime, we have lost 38% of all mammals, not species, but actual physical numbers. We've lost 81% of frogs and toads and those, I've sort of temporarily forgotten their names, those things. And we've lost 36% of fish. So we are destroying our fellow creatures at an alarming rate. The background extinction rate, there's a sort of constant background extinction rate, but we are going, nobody knows exactly how fast, but they estimate between 1,000 and 10,000 times faster than the background extinction rate. So extinctions are happening at a rate that's never been seen before, and we don't know what we're losing. We don't know, we don't even know all the species on the earth, and therefore we don't know what we're losing. But we do know that each one is not only precious to God, but valuable in the biosphere to all of us. So those are the big animals. We know that insects are disappearing. If you go on a drive in the summer, in the olden days, as it were, can you remember you used to get a lot of dead insects on the windscreen and you had to wipe it every so often? Nowadays, you probably notice that rarely happens. There are just far, far, far fewer insects. And insects, of course, as you know, are pollinators. Without insects, we will all die. This is incredibly important stuff. We are filling our oceans with plastic. They reckon that by 2050, plastic will outweigh fish in the sea. So, sorry, that was incredibly brief, but that's a sort of top-level summary of where we're at. And a lot of those things may seem quite far away. So I think what I want to do is to begin to think about, okay, these are the big problems we're facing. So how can we, in our little tiny patches, in our villages and towns around Frome, how can we do things locally which make a difference globally? How can we think global but act local? Again, I'm not going to spend a long time on this, but this is the topic of a whole another series of talks. But as Christians, we are called to care for creation. This is something that perhaps has got a little bit forgotten along the way, but the Bible is full of references to creation care. This is my green Bible, which has 2,220 something references to the planet, to the biosphere, to water, to land, to soil, to harvests, to crops. It is full of references to the environment. And we tend, I think, often to filter that out. We read a passage in the Bible and we see what it says about God, and we see what it says about us, and perhaps how we interact with our neighbours. But what we often forget about is what it's telling us about the land. It's that sort of three-dimensional. It's not just vertical, it's not just horizontal, but it's going down as well. What is our responsibility towards the land? Again, I'm not going to go through all of those 2,200 passages, but the bottom line is this. Jesus taught us to love our neighbour as ourselves. And if we truly love our neighbours, we will love our global neighbours, the ones we've talked about, whose lives are threatened by climate change. They are the first and the worst hit by climate change. We will love our future neighbours, our children and our grandchildren, whose lives will undoubtedly be impacted by climate change and biodiversity loss. And we'll also love our non-human neighbours, the creatures with whom we share the planet. And if we love all of them, then obviously we're called to care for them, to serve them and to preserve them. That's the Genesis passage, isn't it? To serve and preserve, to till and keep, to look after the earth, to be good stewards. So that's what the Bible says. We've looked at science, we've looked at the Bible, and of course the Church of England has something to say as well. As some of you may know, we have 5 marks of mission, which are sort of embedded in church culture. We're taught to proclaim the good news of the kingdom, to teach and baptize, to care for people, to seek justice, and finally to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth. And that's the one I think that often gets missed out. I think if you analysed your Sunday sermons, you probably don't hear as much about number 5 as you do of all the others. And of course, they were never designed to be a list like that. They were designed to be, I've seen them displayed as a sort of overlapping circles, as like a Venn diagram. They all clearly overlap with each other, and they all have a lot to say to each other, but this is an integral part of our faith. This is not an optional extra for a few keen green people who we delegate the responsibility to. And finally, one more, which isn't in that list, which I rather like. This is Rob Parsons, a Christian teacher and leader who died sadly quite a lot of years ago now, but some of you will remember him. And he said this, he said, when Christians take the earth seriously, then people will take the gospel seriously. And I think if for no other reason, I can tell you lots of stories about this, but that's another good reason why we should take it seriously, because I think the world is watching. The world is watching to see what us as the church are doing. We've taken a lead on global justice in the past, but what about the environment today? So we've talked about thinking global, and now we need to think about acting local. So the church nationally has committed to becoming a net zero church by 2030. That happened last March, which is a very ambitious target. It's 20 years ahead of the government target, and it's setting us all some pretty steep challenges ahead. Our own Diocese of Bath and Wells has also embodied that in their environmental policy as of last year. So there's a lot at stake. That's the Bath and Wells website, which has a huge amount of information and resources around the environment. It's just been updated and refreshed recently. If you haven't had a look, do take a look at it. That's the Bath and Wells environmental web page on the website. So in our diocese, we've got lots of stuff going on. The first part of the diocese's policy is that every church is encouraged to think about becoming an eco-church. Now, some of you I know are already on this eco-church journey. Some of you might be thinking about it. Some of you may never have heard about it. Again, we're just whistling through this. I'm sorry, I'm going to talk very fast because we've got a bit more to cover. Eco-church, essentially, it's built around a survey of church life. It starts with worship and teaching. So that's what's preached in the sermons. It's what you study in your Bible studies. It's what the children are doing in their groups. It's everything to do with what about the prayers, everything to do with worship and teaching. Are we taking God's creation into account? What about, secondly, management of church buildings? We may not be able to put solar panels on the roof, but we could buy green electricity. What about our coffee cups? What about our light bulbs? What about our energy tariffs? What about whether we've got cycle racks out for people? All that kind of stuff. So practical stuff around the building. Then the land. What can we do on our church land which encourages biodiversity and stewardship of the earth? Can we have allotments? Could we put up swift boxes or bat boxes? Can we build bug hotels with people in the community? Lots of things we can do with our land. What about advocacy? What about using our voice? Can we advocate for climate justice? Can we advocate for caring for the world around us? These were some photos that a few years ago, some of you may remember, we had a phase of doing quite a few things in and around Frome on this topic with the churches. I can see a few faces there who are on this call tonight. 1, 2, 3. And finally, what about our lifestyle? This in effect is the big multiplier. When what we do as a church is quite a small part of our lives, but when we go home, how do we live? How do we all live? And how do our neighbours live? So that's the 5 eco-church areas. So if every church in our diocese was to become an eco-church, we would be making a really good progress towards fulfilling our diocesan environmental policy. The eco-church scheme has a number of levels. You go from bronze to silver to gold. The bronze award is relatively easy. It gets pretty tough as you go up to silver and gold. If you haven't already had a look at it, do look at the eco-church website. I'll give you the links at the end. But that's something the diocese is encouraging us all to think about. And it's not, eco-church is not an end in itself. It's a tool. It's a way in which we can start to have conversations around some of these issues that we may never have talked about in our churches before. At the moment, the diocese is promoting this fantastic set of seminars led by the Somerset Wildlife Trust called Wilder Churches. And we've had 2 or 3, I think, so far, and the next one's on the 30th of June. These are very practical online Zoom calls, just helping people to think through the issues of how we can improve biodiversity in our churchyards. And that's really what I want to spend the next couple of minutes before we move on to discussion thinking about. It's a very visible thing. Obviously, for many of us in rural areas, the churchyard is probably the first thing you see. People will see in the setting of the church, and it can provoke a lot of conversation and discussion. But Wilder Church is it's very carefully thought through, and it's well worth looking. You can catch up on the videos they've done already, and you can sign up for the next ones. They're using a lot of resources which are prepared by Caring for God's Acre, which is another charity which provides fantastic resources which help you to map and think about how to look after the churchyard in a way which balances the needs of everybody in the community, which is incredibly important. So there are really good resources there to think about. One of the things that we were talking about at the last session, which I wanted to share with you, was what they call the 5 C's when you're thinking about how to manage your churchyard. First one is consideration. They're complicated places, churchyards. You know, people have very strong feelings about churchyards for understandable reasons. So we need to be really careful when we start to change things. Consultation is clearly important. Before we start to change things, it's really good to talk to all the, I don't like that word, but stakeholders, everybody who's engaged with the churchyard. Think about who uses the churchyard. Let's have a conversation with them, find out what they feel and talk to them. And then communicate that. So signs, posters, Facebook messages, emails, letters, whatever you need to do, communicating what your plans are, engaging people. Cooperating not just within the church, but getting other people on board, other local groups, perhaps, wildlife groups, botanists, people who know about bugs and bees and birds and wildflowers, the parish council, people who can maybe provide resources and things, the local school, lots of organisations who might want to be involved, and compromise, really important. We are called to be good stewards of the earth, but doing things too quickly can cause problems. So always look for compromise. You know, we need to be good ambassadors. We don't want these changes to become stumbling blocks for other people. This is a day, fun enough, on Sunday, this just a few days ago in our churchyard, we had an afternoon bio blitz. And so we invited people to come along and discover what was in our churchyard. We found a local lady, the lady there in blue, who's an expert botanist, and she, between her and everybody else, they identified 86 species of plant in our churchyard, flowers and grasses and all sorts of things, which was really fun. And what was lovely, particularly for me, was that a few children came along, and we had hand lenses and computer microscopes and all sorts of stuff, and they really loved exploring and finding out what was there. So it was a great way to engage people, to bring in people who wouldn't necessarily come and spend time in the churchyard, to have conversations about why we're doing this, and hopefully that will lead on to more things. So that was just a little practical example that we did the other day. One of the things I mentioned earlier I wanted to highlight was this communication. These are a few images from other places, but just different ways of communicating. It's incredibly important to tell people what we're doing and why we're doing it, preferably before we start doing it. So signs, notices, leaflets, talks, communicate before and while we start doing things. Make it fun, involve people, but it's absolutely key. Yeah, a couple more images. The top one is when we had a training day that's Holy Trinity Churchyard a couple of years ago now. We were building a bug hotel, learning how to build bug hotels, and other things, you know, in terms of thinking about our church. I mean, we could talk about this all day, but I love that photo of the seat that somebody showed that at a talk I was at recently, and they said, don't just put a boring old bench there. Why don't you use a fallen down tree to get a local carver to build a lovely seat? So there are lots of creative ways in which we can engage and invite people into our churchyards to explore and enjoy creation. I'm going to stop there because I've run out of time. Those are some links. I can send those around afterwards. I can send those to Callie, so she could send those around with the minutes perhaps. But these, I would say, are the really useful sites, websites which you might want to have a look at to find out more. The Church of England's also got huge amounts of resources on their environment page as well. So I'm going to leave it there.